recently found photographies or plates or whatever, since I'm totally ignorant of these things. Welcome to Rick, and I'm very happy that he's actually volunteered to do this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Labika. This afternoon I wanted to do a few things, and I've got to kind of race through this a little bit because there's quite a bit to do here. But my name's Rick Mason. I've got the privilege and pleasure to be a lecturer in photography here at Murdoch University. And in the email that I sent out, there was a web link in there. I don't know, how many managed to have a look at that web link? Yeah, because that's almost the entire collection of what was discovered. And apart from the ones that are so damaged that they just don't really produce any image. And I need to get advice on those ones. This lecture is being recorded, so if you've got any questions, that's fine, and you can ask the questions during the presentations, but just give me a minute to announce the question back to you so that it gets picked up in the recording. Okay, so what I wanted to do is look at the photos and their discovery and history and talk about that, their provenance, if you like, if you will. Makes known the knowledge that we have thus far about who they were and where they were and what we know about the photographs in brief detail. And we'll also look into, we'll make some suggestions perhaps what the photography was about. And indeed, my question, if you like, or my area of interest is potentially whether or not these could be examples of early pictorialist photography, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So, in 2010, acacia photographs were discovered in a house in West Perth, in 16 Carr Street. There was a charity that was clearing out their house at the time, as they do. And one of the things they normally do when they're doing these clearing outs of these houses, of deceased estates and so on, is they have a look under the lino, because sometimes there's things to be found, like old newspapers and the like. Anyway, they were doing this and they found a trapdoor that led down to a cellar. And when they went down into the cellar, there was literally an Aladdin's cave down there of things. Wine and brandy and I believe a camera that I haven't seen, and all sorts of other artefacts. Amongst these artefacts were some 90 quarter glass plate negatives. And that's a large negative made of glass that cameras of the early part of the 20th century were producing. One of the people from the charity, because I'm around op shops quite a bit, looking at old cameras and things, suggested that I might be interested in these, and indeed I was. So here's some of the images, and it becomes apparent quite quickly that from things that are in the photographs and also from handwritten cards that accompanied the photographs, that we're looking at Toodyay, which is a small town just up in the foothills there, and at circa 1910, 1915, around that sort of era. You'll notice that on some of the plates there's detailed information, like this is Toodyay Bridge and Flood, 1917. That's because there were a set of handwritten cards that accompanied the photographs. And these cards seem to offer important clues as to the provenance or the history of these images. Now, to find such a large cache of images intact is virtually unprecedented, as far as I know, at least in WA. There's been there's quite a bit of other early WA photography, but none of it's really the personal vernacular. None of it's really kind of family vernacular. Most of it is, in fact, buildings and objects. There's nothing really quite like this as far as I can discover. There's also quite a bit of material from some of the portrait salons at the time, or professional portrait photographers, and you can look at those in the Batty Library online. And when you look at those, you can see that their stylisation is very similar and very predictable, and not quite like this. So those of you who have had a chance to look through the plates will have seen a lot of images like this. This particular one, Toodyay 23, 23rd car in Toodyay. And there's various individuals and the normal sort of vernacular. So these are the cards that came with them. There's about 7 cards, and Leonie Strickland and I, seated over there, hello Leonie, spent a very pleasurable afternoon trying to decipher the handwriting on these cards and trying to work out which photographs they were matched to, and then started burrowing through Trove, the online resource, and seeing if we could find something to connect the photographs with some sort of history. This in itself is really rare. You almost never get any text with photographs. They just arrive by themselves with nothing. And don't forget, these are negatives. So I had to scan these photographs and produce them as positives in order for you to see them. They were not prints. So from the cards, it was possible to identify some of the individuals in the photographs. A few names popped up continually: Robert Faust, Catherine Faust, Robert Faust here, in front of what is now known to be the Toodyay Club, and Beatty, a young girl who we believe was a niece or perhaps friend of the family, we're not sure. And these 2 young ladies, Kitty Green and Miss May G. The cards themselves, the paper that was written on, had this at the top, the Toodyay Club, so that offered another clue. Turns out that Robert Faust was in fact he was the manager, or the club manager of the Toodyay Club, and he was a farmer, but was the retired club manager. And when we looked up in Trove, we saw that there's a death notice for him there, and he died in West Perth in 1955, but at 16 Car Street. So that was his house. So what we've deduced from that was those photographs and the other items down there had remained undisturbed for something like 60 years. Bit of a shiver, a bit of a chill went down the spine when we realised that was actually Robert Faust's house that the plates were discovered in. So there he is there. He's in front of the Toodyay Club, and there he is there with his wife, Catherine. And one thing you'll be able to see straight away about the photographs is that they produce extraordinary detail, because a quarter plate negative is produced by a camera similar to this one. Perhaps not quite that one, but similar, and it's quite large. In today's world, that'd be equivalent to something like a 100 megapixel camera, so it's a huge amount of detail and quality. Most of the photographs are taken outside because of the limitations at the time of the speed that the cameras could record at, and the medium in which they were recording on, the ISO, if you will. A couple of interesting things to note in there, just some of the signs that you see in some of the photographs. So through Trove, we were able to find out quite a bit of information about these people and what they were doing. And we could see that Robert Faust and his wife lived in Toodyay for a number of years while he managed the club. He was the club steward or manager. He was possibly of German, Austrian extraction, and he'd come to the goldfields in the late 1890s, met Catherine there and married in Boulder. There's also some details about Beatrice, or Miss J. Maslin. So there he is there, and you can see that's an indoor photograph, and you can see the difficulties they had with taking indoor photographs at this time. Quite a few shots like this where Mr. Faust is on the veranda with the hydrangeas, which they're evidently very proud of. So as we know, they were childless, and I got that information from Beth Frayne, who is a local historian and elder of Toodyay. And it's a pity she can't be here today, but Beth's got a wealth of knowledge about Toodyay, and I'm going up to see her next week to talk to her about in depth about some of the things that I've got ideas about. So various other tidbits in there. For instance, Robert Faust was the victim of a robbery in the goldfields and so on, just little things like that. So in terms of other individuals, we know about Armando Pardelli. He was apparently a good friend of Robert Faust, and he's pictured here at a property at Coringa, which is in fact a winery. And from the photos, it looks, I got the impression he was a proprietor there, but apparently that's not the case. But I think he worked there. And there's Coringa today. It's one of the oldest wineries in the state. Catherine Faust and Mrs. Sinclair at a place called Nanarg, which I haven't located yet. Miss Meiji again. Photographic subjects. Well, there's quite a few, but it's the normal sort of thing that we'd find in people's personal vernacular. Things that they're proud of, and things that we would recognise in the vernacular popular photography today. Family gatherings, new cars, pride in the new car. Family gatherings. Chaps having a good time, that sort of thing. People having a good time, then taking the photo of it. Now, I'm not an expert on these early cameras, but Bob Halligan is, who's here today. Hello, Bob. And I was under the impression that they would have had difficulty with the exposure times on cameras of this period, particularly with the sensitivity of the mediums they were recording on, the film, if you like. But I've actually been told that's not actually the case. They had ISO speeds up to 125, and they could shoot quite reliably in daylight with small apertures and so on. Holidays. The new appliance. This is a wool spinner. I didn't recognise it, but Leonie did. And they've taken it outside, of course, so they can get a proper photograph of it. This is actually the courtyard of the Toodyay Club. And events, like this race day here, and you can see all the soldiers, World War I soldiers coming up for the race day and getting involved in a big event. So questions that start to arise and pique the curiosity, well, one of the big ones is, who's the photographer? Who's taking these images? Who's the artist? Here's some of the suspects, or the contenders. We don't know who the photographer is, but it's highly likely that Robert Faust actually purchased the camera. The images remained in his possession, or in his property, and cameras to take these kind of images were expensive. 2 or 3 months average wage. They certainly could have purchased a cheaper camera. There was many cheaper cameras around of the day, the little box brownies, for example, that most people had. So this is a high-quality piece of kit that they had, and they'd spent the money on it. So it's for someone was doing a serious pursuit, so that they could produce high-resolution images. And there's an advert from the Western Mail, December 25th, 1910, and you can just see the prices on there, £13, £15, really quite a tremendous amount of money on those times. Now, these are speculations. And I have to add here that when I posit this as research, this is very early days. This is the first beginnings into this research, and it's going to be quite a time yet before real knowledge has been discovered. And I'd also like to point out that there's many potential research projects in this collection. I'm looking at it from the photographic viewpoint, photographic history, as I'll talk about later, but there's other potential projects as well. There's easily a documentary in here. There's easily history projects. Our speculation, or Vicky's and mine, is that these two ladies, Miss May G and Kitty Green, are essential to this. And the logic is something like this. A lot of it's got to do with this photograph. It's got a lot to do with the way that Kitty Green, in particular, is looking directly into the lens. It's to do with the way that it's been formally staged. This is not an accidental photograph. They've set this up. The camera's on a tripod. Miss Meiji is posing in a very particular way there. They've been composited and they've been placed in a triangle. You can see it's all quite formal. And then you've got Robert Faust in there as well. Robert Faust, who may have been the patron of this photographic circle. So Catherine and Robert Faust didn't have any children. I don't have too much information about Miss Meiji, but Kitty Green was the daughter of one of the landed gentry in the area, a Mr. McDermott, and she would have been a lady of means, young lady of means. Difficult to speculate about the age, but I'm guessing mid to late 20s, something of that nature. But it might have been Catherine Faust. Now, the reason I don't think it's Robert Faust is that he appears in many of the images, many of them. So he's just in front of the camera too much. But one speculation could be that all four of these people were engaged in a little kind of club, an artistic club, a little circle. And perhaps they were doing things like getting involved in taking the photographs, travelling up to Perth to look at exhibitions, and so on. And one of the unfortunate things is I don't have any. These are we only have the negatives. We don't have any prints, so we can't actually see the finalised work. The negative is really only halfway through the process of this type of photography, and printmaking was more than 50% of what occurred, and there was many choices to be made in terms of the stylisation, the papers used, the chemical processes selected, and so on. So, if some prints ever turn up, it would be amazing. But photographs like this really tell us a lot about the formal way in which they were conducting their photography. This is a very formal setup. It's got a very strong compositional style. It's using a tripod. Things have been placed in the medium ground, foreground, medium ground, and far ground. Anybody who has anything to do with photography recognises it immediately as a structured composition. So my research question. Well, the research question that I'm developing is it possible that these photographs, or at least some of them, represent an attempt at the pictorialist style of image making? That the photographer is attempting the photographic art of the day. Does anybody know what pictorialism is, by the way? No? Some of my students did. That's Mrs. Faust and Beattie on the hill there. And Catherine and Robert Faust again. So what's pictorialism? Well, I'll quickly give you a really brief run through what that is, just so that it gives you a context for understanding what I'm talking about. It's an international style and aesthetic movement that dominated photography in its early years. That is, from about 1850 to about 1920. It's extremely successful, it was international, and it had major groups in Europe called the Link Ring, and the United States, the Photo Succession. And in Australia, we had our own group in the eastern states called the Sydney Circle. And their aim was to try and elevate photography to an art form. Till that stage, photography had really only been interpreted as a form of documenting the world, documenting things, scientific recording device. Well, a group of photographers starting in England said, well, perhaps we can use photography for creating art. And they did this mainly by simulating painting. So this is an image by Robert Demachet of France, Paris, and it's behind the scenes. It's a bromide print, so that's a particular type of printing process that produces that kind of yellowy sort of tone, almost sepia tone. It's quite common for people to look at these images and believe that it's just something to do with age. They look this way. Well, it's not. They've been produced to look this way. They were looking to create something that was a little bit obscure, a little bit of impressionist, a little bit tactile, that gave evidence of the hand of the artist. So pictorialism was looking to painting styles to develop its ideas. It really was looking towards style and technique, so that was the high art of the day, of course, painting. In particular, they were looking at pre-Raphaelite painting and symbolist painting for the way that it developed its motifs, iconography, and so on. And thereby developed a tremendous interest in mythology, hermetic symbols, allegory, and mysticism, things of that nature. So they're characterised by a very soft look, a very kind of grainy look, and really a rejection of the sharp, clear, mechanical, cold representation that the rest of the society was looking for from the camera. So quite typical of the type of imagery, trying to develop a mystical aspect. You see a lot of hermetic symbols and orbs and things of that nature. And quite a few of the artists working in this area had a strong emphasis in things like theosophy. So the pictorialists are concerned with creating an image rather than just taking one and using forms of manipulation, anything they could think of, to try and produce a work of their own, a print of their own, an individual one-off print. And it was the print that meant something, of course. That was the final artwork. So they're doing things like soft focus, brush strokes, painting and scratching the negative, Vaseline on the lens, putting a stocking in between the lens and the plate, and all these sorts of things. They were trying to emulate painting and weren't interested in describing the world in what they saw as a mechanical means. So tremendously textural. This is a gun bichromate print, which is another type of printing process. And this group was strongly informed by the pre-Raphaelite painters of the day, who were also rejecting modernism, rejecting a lot of the industrialisation that was occurring in the countries at the time. And they were going back to more traditional forms, and indeed they were looking towards a style of painting that predated Raphael. Post-Raphael, a lot of the painters are using mechanical devices, somewhat ironically the camera obscura, which is a camera device which focuses light onto a plane so that you can trace it and thereby produce an exact reproduction of whatever it's copying. They were eschewing those ideas and really going for strong colours, elaborate symbolism, a tremendous amount of allegorical work, looking for things in myth or in the Bible, perhaps, or indeed in early traditions. I'll put this particular one up there because in some of the photographs I'm going to show, you can see these sorts of themes starting to come through. Now, the Pre-Raphaelites weren't, they were contemporaries of the early photographers. It was happening at the same time, in the 1850s and 60s. Photography had only been invented in 1830-odd, so it was really quite soon after the invention of photography. So they were contemporaries. So the early photographers like Julia Margaret Cameron, they knew John Everett Millais. In fact, they socialised together. They were part of a group that met together, in fact, at Julia Margaret Cameron's house. This particular painting I'm showing here because it's Persephone. It's the daughter of Demeter, and it's telling the story of Persephone, or it's actually Demeter, I'll get it right, Persephone having to go to the underworld and eating the pomegranate against the wishes of Hades, and thereby causing drought and so on. So Demeter is the goddess of the harvest, and that's one of the themes that we're going to see coming up. So the photographers at the time who were working or following the Pre-Raphaelite style included, very famously, Julia Margaret Cameron, and you can see again it's got that very soft, very ethereal, very dreamy, very romantic, I'd have to say, visualization. For any of you who have seen the Joy Division cover, Closer album cover, it's using that stylization to produce that image. So this is an album in print. The print surface is covered with egg to get that particular look. And you can see strong allegorical themes coming through. So this is what was happening in Britain and America at the same time. Now, the question is, well, what I'm positing is that there seems to be evidence of some of this pictorialist style in these Toodyay images. And it's a little bit difficult to, what's difficult to absolutely prove because we've only got the negatives, we don't have the prints. The prints is where a lot of this happened, but the use of symbols and shimmering light is a big part of it for the pictorialists. So you've got Catherine Faust here at the hill with Miss Sinclair, and they've been placed on the hill in a particularly beautiful afternoon with shimmering light coming through, and they're holding these sheeps in a very kind of allegorical sort of style. So there's Demeter, as often depicted in a statue, with the sheaf, mother of Persephone, who was the subject of Rossetti's work. And of course, Rossetti was all the time meeting and visiting and attending soirees held by Julia Margaret Cameron in London in the 1860s and 70s. So there seems to be quite a close connection. Soft focus to create impressionistic dots and streaks. And there seems to be some evidence on the plates themselves that they've been interfered with, that they've been touched and moved, and it could just be regular damage. But when we compare it to shots that are sharp and clear and obviously don't have the same themes, they don't have that evidence. It's not there. So it poses these intriguing questions about whether this is a possibility. Beautiful, soft, and almost drawing you into the image with its texturality. Very different from the sharp photographs of the cars and things, for example. And also, you could argue there's evidence of Japanese compositional devices that the pictorialists favoured, particularly the Australian pictorialists, I'll talk about in a minute, using those strong diagonal compositional devices. And really, some of the photographs, they just develop an ethereal, sort of completely dreamy, impressionistic sort of look that is hard to ignore. Children were used a lot in, were the subjects, sorry, of a lot of British pictorialist photography in particular. Often placing them as in kind of cherub-type scenarios. So I've mentioned this, that we only have the negatives. It'd be fantastic if some of these, if there are any prints made. That would be a major discovery if we could find some prints, and then really that would tell us a lot about what was going on. Now, we had pictorialism in Australia as well. People like Howard Chasno, Jack Cato, Oliver Cotton, John Kaufman, Stanley Trope, and Max Dupain. Some of these people went on to be modernists, but they certainly had their early photography in the bounds of pictorialism. And the Australian pictorialists, at least in the first part, and Helen Ennis in her article in the history of photography, Helen Ennis is she heads the faculty of arts in ANU, and she did a paper on Australian pictorialism, and she divides it up into two groups. A kind of a pre-war group that was very English in its approach and style, and a post-war group that is immediately identifiable as Australian in theme and content. So the early groups were very much following the English style, producing these kind of fantasy arrangements, all staged, all kind of very composed for the camera, and trying to develop these allegorical and mythological and scenes, almost all involving women. And the landscape elements were very soft, not extremely identifiable as Australian. Could be anywhere, could be European. So if you're thinking about the Impressionist painting that's going on at the time, you would see a lot of similarity, Monet perhaps, in investigating the nature of vision. After World War I, Helen Ennis makes the observation, really, and it's a fairly strong observation, that Australian themes begin to appear. And it wasn't just in the photography either, it was also happening in the other visual arts. In painting. So it's quite possible that this was a newfound creation of or emergence of identity after World War I, the experience of World War I, and certainly we began to see elements like the bush, people on the land, working on the land, strong Australian rural types, Australian trees, Australian landscape, and Australian light, importantly. All of the pictorialist work up to this stage, and indeed a lot of the painting work up to this stage, had a soft romantic glow to it. Suddenly, the images are clearly taking the middle of the day in bright, white Australian light. And this was happening in painting at the same time with people like Streeton, famously, Frederick McCubbin, and Hans Haysen, amongst others. So now we're starting to see, although we're still seeing some of the shapes and some of the mythological type forms and things, we're starting to see the Australian landscape. And this is a very famous one by Max Dupain, the Blue Cum Forest. Recognisable as an Australian image. But still having that kind of soft, tactile, highly textured look to it. And here's Robert Faust, out in the bush with a billy can. This is not a man who has spent much time in the bush. He was a steward of the Toodyay Club. He's dressed formally. It's hard not to make the comparison. Perhaps they came to Perth and saw the exhibition. Perhaps they went to the Eastern States and saw the exhibitions. Many people did. Many people, those exhibitions, those painting exhibitions at the time were hugely popular. It was one of the main visual media forms of the day. That's what you did. You went to the exhibitions and you saw the exhibitions. Strong Australian light and trees, Stirling Hill. That particular plate's been damaged, unfortunately. But you can get the idea. Arthur Streeton working in exactly the same area. Suddenly we've got bright, white Australian light. Not the soft, romantic European light. So we started to see in Australian pictorialism, Rose Simmons, who, tall and stately there. Australian iconography, the Guardian gum. So I think Helen Ellis is making a fairly strong case here that this is occurring. Indeed, these pictorialists in the Eastern States call themselves the Sunshine School. Kind of sweet. And I think we're seeing it in these images too. Somewhat coincidentally, and a fairly exciting prospect, is that the Art Gallery of New South Wales at the moment, they're just staging one of the largest exhibitions of early Australian photography that's ever been mounted, and along with symposiums and all the rest of it. So I'll be trekking over there next week and have a look at that, and I hope to have a chat with Helen Ellis and show her these images and see what she makes of them. Okay, there's my references. Thanks for attending today. It's been a pleasure, and if anybody's interested in perhaps talking about other potential research projects surrounding this cache of images, please come forward and make yourself known. Thank you.